9:30 a.m. Rise and shine. The shrill klaxon of the alarm clock startles us from a deep snooze. We lift our head from the warm pillow, our moistened drool pooling in its folds, and prise apart our gunk-glued eyes to squint at the time, desperately hoping the clock has malfunctioned and there are at least 2 more hours of slumber available. Sadly, a corroborating glance at our mobile phone proves it's definitely time to get up. Why does the clock's testimony matter so much? Why don't we just go back to sleep until we're fully rested? Well, because time is the architecture that governs the rhythms of our existence, and to ignore it is to invite chaos into our lives. Yet, though time is a stable entity that has reliably flowed for millions of years, its measurement has always been a tricky conundrum. Our strict division of standardized units, seconds, minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, years, is not a universal law echoed through eternity, but an agreed-upon rubric, adopted over the course of many centuries in a desperate attempt to avoid mind-scrambling confusion. In fact, to delve into the history of timekeeping is similar to watching a Belgian soap opera without the subtitles. At first it's baffling, but slowly it becomes strangely compelling. Good day. Today is Saturday, and we know that because yesterday was Friday. But what do we mean when we talk about a day? The English language is often dubbed the most bountiful of all, with an ever-swelling vocabulary, so it's faintly ridiculous that in English-speaking countries we deploy one word, day, to mean 2 different things. 1, a 24-hour rotation of the Earth on its axis, and 2, the opposite of night. Despite it clearly being a communication trip hazard, we persist with this clumsy inelegance because we're proudly stubborn and clearly a little bit thick. Many other languages don't go in for such silliness. The Dutch, for example, sidestep confusion with 2 words instead. Dag, the daylight hours, and etmaal, 24 hours. While Bulgarians, Danes, Italians, Finns, Russians, and Poles all do something similar. But the closest English speakers get to etmaal is with the ludicrously thrilling Nycthemeron, night and day in Greek. It's a name more befitting a Finnish heavy metal band. I've never actually heard it used in conversation, and even scientists ignore it, so it's become the undernourished pet of etymologists who take it out of the box at special occasions to coo at its grandiose absurdity. But Anglophones muddle through regardless, or occasionally move the goalposts by measuring time's duration in nights instead, as when we book hotel rooms by cunningly deploying the Anglo-Saxon word fortnight to indicate a block of 14 nights in a row. But even this doesn't entirely work, because the travel agent will inevitably ask, is that 14 days, 13 nights? And we have to start counting it out on our fingers, like kids learning their times tables. But let's not judge too harshly, as it's partially an inherited failing. Terminology for what constitutes a day has always been an awkward problem. In the 3rd century, the Roman philosopher Censorinus argued that the 24-hour cycle should be named a civil day, while daylight hours should instead constitute a natural day. While this was seemingly sensible, a gaggle of meddling 7th century pedants sowed confusion by switching natural day to instead mean the 24-hour rotation cycle, and they introduced artificial day to cover the daylight period. But don't bother committing these definitions to memory in the hope of wowing your friends, because modern astronomy has once again reverted to using a civil day to describe a full rotation of the Earth. Consequently, natural day has gone from meaning 2 separate things to now meaning nothing at all, while artificial day is now what comes out of a light bulb. Got that? No, me neither. But I'm afraid almost nothing in this chapter is simple, not even the definition of when a day begins and ends. In the midnight hour. Opening our tired eyes wider, we see that the sunlight is streaming through a chink in the curtains, so it's definitely the morning. Except, daylight is not a prerequisite for the morning, is it? In both the modern West and East, a new day begins in the dark at 0000, which is why British revellers at New Year's Eve parties drunkenly garble the first 2 lines of Auld Lang Syne as the clock strikes midnight. But imagine the chaos if these intoxicated partygoers were forced to wait until dawn, getting drunker and drunker. It would sound less like a communal sing-song and more like a herd of cattle being drowned at sea. Midnight, though, is a confusing word. Its syllables say, this is the middle of the night, and yet it actually signals the start of the morning, leading us to wrongly label 1 a.m. TV broadcasts as late-night telly, or boast about being up all-night partying when we get home at 4 a.m. This blurring of the lines, letting a day stay up past its official bedtime, shows that the way we live our life has a surprising thing in common with a civilization that reached its peak around 3,500 years ago, ancient Egypt. In their hyper-religious culture, it was dawn that commenced a new day, not midnight. Consequently, the sunrise was heralded as a sacred event, the beginning of the daily commute undertaken by the sun god Ra, in which he charged across the sky in his chariot and then had to fight an epic battle with the serpentine chaos god Apophis. But to validate this eternal routine and make the sun rise, a dawn ceremony required the semi-divine pharaoh to perform cleansing rituals in the sacred temples of Karnak or Heliopolis. In practice, a proxy likely stood in for the king, who may often have been elsewhere in the empire, though it's very tempting to enjoy the mental image of a priest hastily having to mumble the half-remembered words while anxious servants desperately try to haul a grumpy Tutankhamun out of bed. Teenagers, eh? But beginning a day at dawn wasn't a universal ancient custom. 4,000 years ago, the Babylonians, the occupants of majestic cities in what's now Iraq, shared much in common with their Bronze Age Egyptian neighbours. But their new day commenced at dusk, moments before they went to bed. This was later mimicked by the ancient Greeks, Celts, Germanic tribes, and even medieval Italians, who knew this timekeeping system as Florentine Reckoning, which is a great title for a murder mystery novel, just in case you're planning one. Neither is this a relic from the long-dead past, as an Orthodox Jew will still observe the Shabbat between Friday sundown and Saturday dusk. So how did the modern world end up with the midnight cut-off point? The answer is probably from the Romans, who divided the day and night into 2 blocks of 12 hours. Of course, the big question is, who invented timekeeping in the first place? Did a Sumerian just wake up one morning, decide this was 7 a.m, and everyone else just shrugged in nonplussed agreement? Yeah, all right then. That seems unlikely. I think we might have to go back further to find an answer. The clock in the sky. The Makapan Valley in the Limpopo province of South Africa is one of those gorgeous landscapes that looks like it's been digitally rendered by a Hollywood effects artist. It's a lush, V-shaped valley, sprouting with green trees that turn russet in the autumn, and you wouldn't be entirely surprised to see pterodactyls swooping overhead. Jutting out of the forests are imposing limestone hills, in which a network of caves was slowly carved by ancient water erosion. And it's in these secluded shelters that archaeologists have discovered some extraordinary prehistoric remains, including the bones of one of our earliest ancestors, Homo australopithecus. Here, 3 million years ago, one of these diminutive upright creatures must have noticed the lengthening shadows in the evening gloom and waddled off to the safety of the caves. Though the stone walls may have offered temporary shelter, they couldn't prevent the inevitable, and the sheltering hominin breathed its last breath within the limestone cavern, only to be rediscovered by paleontologists in the 20th century. Australopithecus possessed virtually none of our intellectual powers and would have been really crap at crosswords, yet even this primitive creature might have noticed the natural world's cyclical rhythms, the waxing and waning of the moon, the lapping of the tides, and the parade of quarterly seasons. The Earth ceaselessly revolves on its axis, flooding our lives with light and darkness like an incessant heartbeat, and Australopithecus could have relied upon the sun's arced journey through the sky each day, knowing it would return after dark. In short, he or she probably had a basic comprehension of time. This, however, is just guesswork. Where's the actual evidence for Stone Age timekeeping? If we fast forward to 30,000 years ago, a time when modern humans shared the planet with Neanderthals, then we encounter an enticingly ambiguous object found at Le Placard in the Dordogne region of France. It's an eagle bone, and scratched across its surface are a series of notches, carved horizontally at different times, which appear to chart the waxing of the moon through 14 days, from new to full. It's sorely tempting, therefore, to refer to this bone as the world's oldest known calendar. Though it's not impossible that this was made by a Neanderthal, many archaeologists suspect that this rival clan of Homo was ill-matched against our superior cognitive adaptability. They were the Judge Dredd to our Sherlock Holmes. Stronger, more robust, better at punching a bear right in its stupid ursine face, but also more likely to scream in frustration if you'd ask them to adjust the clock on a microwave. Instead, then, it was probably a human like us, an inventive Homo sapiens, brimming with natural curiosity, who conceivably peered at the moon in wonder and decided to chart its phases on a bit of bone salvaged from last night's dinner, taxing its refined brain in the pursuit of elemental understanding about how the cosmos functioned. But then again, maybe it was just someone doodling while having a poo. Hard to tell. After all, just because we are using our clock to measure time in a uniform way doesn't mean our ancestors did. Even just a couple of centuries ago, there was a major temporal shift that dramatically chucked out the 24-hour clock we hold so dear. Vive la Révolution! The year was 1793, and France was in the grip of a violent revolution. King Louis XVI was already minus his head, having fallen victim to the guillotine that would soon stain the Parisian cobbles with a scarlet treacle of noble and peasant blood. And European politicians were gawping in horror at the tumult which might infect their own populace at any moment. The world was aflame with big ideas, and French society was being redrawn on a blank sheet of paper by a cadre of radical intellectuals fired up by Enlightenment philosophy. Nothing would escape their gaze, and even time itself was about to get a top-down redesign. For over 4,000 years, the duodecimal mathematics of the Babylonians had stubbornly prevailed. But why had it been based on the number 12 and not 10? Well, 10 is only divisible by integers of 2 and 5, whereas 12 is divisible by 2, 3, 4, and 6, making it much more versatile in mathematical calculations. What's more, the use of a lunisolar calendar, based on observations of both the sun and the moon, relied on there being 12 lunar phases per year, with a 13th leap month chucked in every 2 or 3 years. So, to the Babylonians, 12 was the numerical cornerstone of the universe. Logically, therefore, time should operate in a duodecimal rubric, with 60 seconds in a minute and 24 hours in a day. But that was ancient thought, and this was 1793. And the French Revolution wasn't just about bewigged aristos getting their comeuppance from a hungry mob. Its leaders also sought to break with the traditions of the corrupted past in favour of scientific rationalism. For more than 2 centuries, European philosophers had been muttering amongst themselves about a possible metric system. But now, a window in which to test it had arrived. So, on the 5th of October, a proposal lodged a year earlier by Jean-Charles de Bourda was voted into law by the new National Assembly. The 24-hour day was suddenly chopped up into 10 distinct hours, with each hour comprising 100 minutes, and each minute lasting 100 seconds. As you might have guessed, the rest of the calendar was also carefully redrafted, so weeks became 10-day decades, thereby unintentionally mirroring the ancient Egyptian week, and the year shrank to 10 newly christened months, with splendidly prosaic names like Ventreuse, the windy month, which referred to blustery February, rather than the Christmas period, when we often find ourselves embarrassingly gaseous from overindulgence. This decimalised timekeeping was proudly pronounced as evidence of French innovation, but in fact, the ancient Chinese had already dabbled with it for centuries until, somewhat ironically, they'd been convinced to ditch it by European merchants. Clearly, the French authorities had not received the memo. Soon, they would regret their ignorance. Yes, metric time was woefully unpopular, and despite attempts at appeasement by building hybrid clocks showing both 24 hours and 10 hours on the face, this endeavour was widely considered a literal waste of time. Mass guillotining the French could just about stomach, but 10-hour clocks? Madness. Embarrassingly for all involved, the much-vaunted decimal revolution endured barely 18 months, or was it 14 decimal months, I'm not sure, before being hastily replaced by good old duodecimal time. But hang on a second, I hear you exclaim in unison. What was that bit about the Egyptians having a 10-day week? That's not duodecimal. Yeah, about that bit. Now's probably a good moment to get to grips with the how of horological history. You might need to concentrate for this bit, so make yourself comfy. It's about to get fairly technical. Seasons in the sun. If we were to look at a calendar on our wall, we would see that our system allots 7 days to each week, imitating that of the Babylonians. But Egyptians fused that custom with their own innovations to produce a separate timekeeping system. Unlike the Mesopotamians, they chose to cram their annual calendar with 36 weeks of 10 days, leaving a spare 5 bonus days to be arbitrarily tacked on at the end. What's more, having 10-day weeks also meant they preferred to recognise only 3 seasons of 4 months, instead of our 4 seasons of 3 months. This was mostly due to the River Nile's capricious mood swings that brought annual flooding during a large part of the year, and resulted, of course, in a calendar carved up into agricultural cycles of flooding, crop sowing, and harvesting, rather than our spring, summer, autumn, and winter. But how was a day parcelled up? Well, an Egyptian 24-hour Nycthemeron, sorry, it's just such fun to say, was not defined like our 2 daily halves of 12 hours, but as 4 phases. 1 hour of half-light, followed by 10 hours of daylight, chased by another hour of half-light, and then 12 hours of darkness. The big questions, then, are whether Egyptians could measure hours, and if so, how? And the answers are an exultant yes, and it's complicated, but basically it involved the sky. When it came to daylight hours, sundials were the preferred technology, and we'll get to those shortly. But it's the night hours that were much harder to track, which is what makes the Egyptian solution so ingenious. Written in the stars. Have you ever gazed at the stars just before the dawn? As romantic 18-year-olds, my friends and I thought we'd do it on the first morning of the new millennium. We'd quite literally partied like it was 1999, and then we drunkenly clambered up a hill to watch the sunrise on this glorious new epoch. Sadly for us, the sky was cloudy, and the glorious sunrise was ruined by the orange glow of Sevenoaks' streetlights, so we trudged back to the house and ate donuts instead. So much for romance. But if we'd chosen a less light-polluted promontory and a country with better weather, we might have glimpsed something known to astronomers as heliacal rising. Just before the dawn, certain stars called decans briefly peek over the eastern horizon. These groups of 36 constellations drift westerly each day by a single degree, appearing each morning slightly further across until they pass out of view for a whole year. A new star peeps, like a curious meerkat, over the eastern horizon every 10 days, hence the name Dekanoi, meaning 10th in Greek. And this possibly influenced the Egyptians to choose a 10-day week. But what does this have to do with telling the time? Well, scribbled on sarcophagi and inscribed on tomb walls, ancient Egyptian scholars left behind their star charts and calendars, which have allowed modern archaeo-astronomers to decipher their cunning system for turning heliacal rising into a nocturnal clock. The so-called diagonal star table, at first glance, and several increasingly confused glances after that, resembled what might happen if an unfortunate software glitch converted a bus timetable into hieroglyphs. Running horizontally along the top of the chart were the 36 weeks of the year, each of which contains 10 days, and below each of these 36 columns were symbols representing when each decan was visible in which week of the year. In the simplest terms possible, if you knew what the exact date was, the diagonal star table allowed you to match the position of a specific decan star in the sky to the data in your chart, thereby revealing the approximate hour. In around 1500 BCE, this system was replaced with an even more complex alternative called the Ramesside star clock, which sounds like the name of a 1970s prog rock album. Its most notable novelty was that it required the year to be divided into 24 months of 15 days, and focused on a new gaggle of 47-hour stars. Also, to look at this design, again depicted on tombs and sarcophagi, is to wonder if we're staring at the instructions for a complex board game. At the bottom of the image is a kneeling male priest in a nifty linen kilt, and above his head is a checkered grid comprising 7 vertical transecting lines, resembling a sort of archaic chessboard, in which star movements could be charted. As far as scholars can tell, a budding astronomer was supposed to mimic the position of this priest, holding perhaps a plumb bob in his outstretched hand and using his own body parts as comparative references for the position of these stars lined up to the vertical lines. Perhaps he was also meant to squat over a pool of water to reflect the stars above him as he did so. The debate rages on. The wonky hours. Tracking the transit of stars was a cunning response to the thorny problem of nocturnal timekeeping. But an Egyptian hour was not a standardized unit like our 60 minutes. Instead, it stretched and shrank to match the seasons. A daylight hour could be just 45 modern minutes in winter, and closer to 75 minutes in the sun-drenched summer. The ancients explained this by theorizing that the sun orbited the Earth, not around the equator, but following an ecliptic plane, which started below the equator in the winter, then sloped upwards so that it rose above it in the summer before descending again. If that doesn't quite make sense in your head, imagine a ringed frisbee placed at a diagonal slant over the middle of a beach ball, so it's lower on the left and higher on the right. This, at least in Egyptian eyes, explained why the sun was higher in the summer sky. Consequently, there were always 10 hours of full daylight, plus 2 of half-light, but each of those hours was longer in July than in December, a phenomenon we might call seasonal hours. But even a seasonal hour was impossible to measure by stars alone in the middle of the day, so ancient timekeepers had to find another way of keeping track. Give me sunshine. When the stars vanished and the sun came out, the methods changed again. Herodotus, the ancient Greek writer, often dubbed the father of history, claimed it was those cunning Babylonians who first conjured up the sundial, but it probably sprang up independently in various cultures, as the basic technological requirements are little more than an upright stick poking out of the ground. Anyway, if I asked you to name a famous ancient sundial, you wouldn't plump for anything Babylonian. But if you live in Paris, London, or New York, then you might suggest an Egyptian example that you've often walked past, and not one secreted behind glass cases in museums, but proudly erected in the open air. What am I referring to? Well, they're popularly nicknamed Cleopatra's Needles, despite having nothing to do with the famous queen. In fact, they're nearly 3,500 years old, and by the time she was bumping uglies with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, these obelisks had already been standing guard in the sun-worshipping city of Heliopolis for 1,400 years. To be honest, archaeologists don't know if their purpose was deliberately temporal, or if they were just massive ornaments that accidentally happened to cast a shadow. And even if they were designed to tell the time, their size made them impractical for day-to-day usage. You can't really put one in your house. So smaller alternatives were sought. The simplest of these were shadow clocks, which were essentially just a long plank with an upright T-shape stuck on one end. Similar, I suppose, to the rear spoiler on a racing dragster. And this thereby elevated the crossbar off the ground so as to cast a diagonal shadow onto the long plank. When the sun was low in the sky, the shadow was elongated and reached the very end of the plank like a black cat stretching out to bask in the midday heat. But by late morning, the sun would be at its zenith, almost directly over the crossbar, so the shadow would shorten. At noon, the shadow clock would suddenly become useless. Even by mobile phone standards, this is a lightning-quick rate of obsolescence, but no expensive upgrade was required. All you had to do was turn the clock around to face the west instead of the east, so it could measure the sun's descent rather than its rise. Or at least, that's the current theory. The problem is that no Egyptian examples, whether written, archaeological, or illustrated, actually show any evidence of a crossbar ever existing. Basically, we don't actually know how shadow clocks worked, or if they even had crossbars at all. We can be a bit more authoritative.